"Take the old cabin and leave," my son said during my husband's will reading. My daughter-in-law smiled beside him like she'd been waiting years to hear those words out loud. I folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. 3 days later, I found something hidden behind my husband's desk that changed everything. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the people who betray you the worst are the ones you spent your whole life protecting. The law office smelled like polished wood, stale coffee, and rain-soaked wool coats. Outside, a cold October drizzle coated downtown Hartford in a gray haze. Water slid slowly down the tall windows behind Mr. Kaplan's desk, blurring the city lights into soft streaks. It had been only 4 days since we buried my husband Richard Whitmore beside the white church where we'd been married for 43 years. 4 days. I still caught myself reaching for his hand. I still expected to hear his footsteps behind me. At 71, grief felt less like crying and more like losing gravity. Everything inside me felt heavier than it should have. Michael sat across from me beside his wife, Vanessa. My son wore the same navy suit he'd worn at the funeral, though now the tie hung loose around his neck, like the mourning period had already expired. Vanessa looked immaculate in cream-colored wool and diamond earrings that reflected the office lights every time she tilted her head. She didn't look sad. She looked impatient. At the time, I didn't realize how important that detail would become.
Mr. Kaplan adjusted his glasses and opened Richard's will carefully, clearing his throat before speaking. Richard Whitmore, being of sound mind. Vanessa interrupted him with a soft sigh. "Can we please make this quick?" she asked. "We've both missed work already." I looked at her then, really looked at her, not as my son's wife, not as the woman I'd hosted every Thanksgiving for the last 14 years. I looked at her as a stranger sitting inches away from my husband's memory. Michael reached for her hand immediately. That hurt more than I expected. The same little boy who used to run into my kitchen after Little League practice with grass stains on his jeans now looked at his wife before looking at me. I thought that was the worst part. I was wrong. Mr. Kaplan continued reading, his voice quieter now. Richard had left several charitable donations, a contribution to the Church Restoration Fund, money for veteran outreach programs, scholarships at the local community college. Typical Richard. Even after death, he still wanted to take care of people. Then came the properties. The primary residence located in West Hartford. Vanessa straightened immediately. I noticed the look she exchanged with Michael. Small, fast, practiced. Something cold moved quietly through my stomach. Mr. Kaplan paused briefly. That property shall remain under the management of the Whitmore family estate until all conditions outlined in Appendix C are fulfilled.
Vanessa frowned. "What conditions?" she asked sharply. Mr. Kaplan glanced down at the papers. "Those conditions are explained later in the document." She leaned back slowly, clearly irritated. Beside me, my black gloves rested neatly in my lap. Richard had bought them for me during a Christmas trip to Vermont, nearly 20 years ago. I suddenly found myself rubbing the leather softly with my thumb, just to keep my hands steady. Rain tapped harder against the windows. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Michael sighed loudly. "Mom," he said, finally looking at me directly, "maybe we should just talk openly here." A strange silence settled over the room, the kind that arrives before something breaks. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other. It amazed me how comfortable she suddenly looked, like she'd rehearsed this. Michael rubbed the back of his neck before speaking again. "You know this house is too much for you now." The words landed softly at first, then deeper, like stones sinking underwater. I blinked slowly. "Too much?" "The taxes alone are insane," Vanessa added quickly. "Not to mention maintenance. Heating that place in Connecticut winters costs a fortune." I stared at her. This woman had spent 14 Christmas mornings in that house. 14. Richard built the wraparound porch with his own hands while Michael was still in high school. We planted hydrangeas together near the front walk the summer before retirement. Every floorboard carried pieces of our life. But Vanessa said that place,
the way someone talks about an outdated hotel.
Michael leaned forward. "We've been thinking," he said carefully, "that maybe it makes more sense for you to move somewhere smaller." There it was. Not grief, not concern. A plan. I felt it immediately, like stepping into cold lake water. Mr. Kaplan shifted uncomfortably in his chair but remained silent. I looked toward the rain outside, because suddenly I couldn't look directly at my son anymore. The city lights blurred behind the glass. For a moment, I remembered another rainy afternoon nearly 30 years earlier. Michael was 11. He'd come home crying because another boy mocked his secondhand sneakers. Richard sat beside him for over an hour in the garage, teaching him that kindness mattered more than money. "We take care of family," Richard had said. I can still hear his voice, which made what happened next feel even crueler. Vanessa smiled faintly. "There's always the lake cabin," she said. "It's small, quiet, manageable." The cabin, Richard's old family property near Lake Waramack. Tiny, isolated, forgotten, or so they thought. Michael nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "you could stay there comfortably." I finally looked back at him. "Comfortably?" He exhaled impatiently. "Mom, come on, let's not make this emotional." Emotional. I almost laughed. My husband was dead, and my son was discussing my removal like a scheduling issue. Something inside me began cooling rapidly. Not anger, something quieter, more dangerous. Vanessa leaned toward me then, lowering her voice slightly, as if pretending compassion. "The truth is," she said softly, "Michael and I need space to start the next chapter of our lives." Need space. In the house I spent 4 decades building. The humiliation arrived slowly. That was the worst part. Not shouting, not cruelty. The calm entitlement. I felt suddenly aware of everything around me. The ticking brass clock, the smell of wet umbrellas, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Tiny details burned into memory. Because deep down, I think part of me already understood. My life was splitting into before and after. Michael cleared his throat. "So, take the old cabin and leave." The sentence hung in the room like smoke. Vanessa didn't react, because she'd already heard it before. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might lose breath for a second. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply folded my gloves carefully and rested them beside my purse. Then I smiled, very slightly. Vanessa looked surprised by that. She expected tears, begging, maybe outrage. Instead, I said quietly, "I see." That unsettled her more than anger would have. At the time, they mistook silence for weakness. That was their first mistake. Mr. Kaplan suddenly spoke up. "I do think we should finish reviewing the remainder of the will before making assumptions." Vanessa's expression sharpened immediately. "What assumptions?" she asked. But the lawyer avoided her eyes. Interesting. Very interesting. A small flicker of suspicion moved through me for the first time that afternoon. Richard had never been careless. Not with money, not with family, not with me. And suddenly I remembered something strange from 2 months earlier. Richard sitting alone in his study late at night. Stacks of paperwork spread across his desk. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and said, "Just making sure things end up where they belong." At the time, I thought he meant retirement paperwork. Now, I wasn't so sure. Mr. Kaplan continued reading, but Vanessa grew visibly restless. Her manicured nails tapped softly against the armrest. Tick, tick, tick. Every sound seemed louder in that office. Then another detail caught my attention. Michael wouldn't look directly at Mr. Kaplan anymore. Only Vanessa. Always Vanessa. A terrible realization began forming quietly inside me. This conversation hadn't started after Richard died. It started long before the funeral, maybe long before the hospital. I thought back to Richard's final week, the tension in the house, the whisper of conversation stopping when I entered rooms, Vanessa suddenly insisting on helping with paperwork, Michael avoiding eye contact at dinner. At the time, grief blurred everything. Now the puzzle pieces started shifting, and I began wondering something that chilled me far more than their betrayal. What exactly had Richard discovered before he died? Mr. Kaplan closed the folder at last. There are additional estate matters, he said carefully, that will require further discussion privately. Vanessa straightened immediately. What does that mean? It means, he replied calmly, that Richard left detailed instructions regarding certain protected assets. Protected assets. Vanessa's face changed instantly. Very small, very fast. But I saw it. Fear. My pulse slowed unexpectedly. Not from relief, from instinct. Richard had known something. I could feel it now, like his presence lingering quietly in the room beside me.
Michael stood abruptly. "Can we just handle this later?" he muttered. Vanessa grabbed her purse immediately, forcing a smile that looked painfully rehearsed. "We're all emotional right now." "No, not emotional. Exposed. There's a difference." We stood slowly. My knees ached from sitting too long, but I refused to let anyone help me. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The sidewalks glistened beneath the streetlights as people hurried past with umbrellas and coffee cups, completely unaware that my family had just fractured beyond repair inside that office. As we reached the elevator, Vanessa touched my arm lightly. The gesture felt colder than the rain outside. "We'll help you move this weekend," she said sweetly. Move. Not discuss, not consider. Move. I looked down at her perfectly manicured hand resting against my coat sleeve. Then I smiled again, softly. "Thank you, Vanessa." For one brief second, uncertainty crossed her face. Good. The elevator doors opened. Michael walked ahead without looking back. Just like that. The boy I raised, the man Richard loved, gone. Or maybe he'd been disappearing for years, and I was only now willing to see it. The ride home felt endless. Streetlights passed in long golden streaks across the windshield, while Hartford disappeared behind us, mile by mile. Vanessa chatted quietly about paint colors for the upstairs bedrooms, as if I weren't sitting directly beside her. I listened silently. Every word mattered now. Every careless detail. At one point she laughed softly and said, "The master suite gets amazing morning light." Gets, not got. She already considered it hers. Michael didn't correct her. That hurt more than the will reading itself. But something else bothered me even more. Richard's lawyer had looked nervous. Not confused, not sympathetic. Nervous. And I couldn't stop thinking about the phrase, protected assets. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the house stood dark beneath the maple trees, massive and silent against the Connecticut night sky. Home. Or perhaps not anymore. I stepped slowly onto the front porch, hearing the old wood creak beneath my shoes, exactly the way it had every autumn for 27 years. Richard always said he'd fix that step. He never got the chance. I unlocked the front door carefully. The smell hit me immediately. His cologne. Faint. Lingering. Still there. My throat tightened for the first time all day. Behind me, Vanessa whispered something to Michael that I couldn't hear, but I noticed this. She stopped smiling the moment I walked into Richard's study and quietly closed the door behind me. Because deep down, I think she knew there were things inside that room she hadn't found yet, and neither had I. But I was about to. What I discovered the next morning changed everything. The house sounded different after Richard died. Not quieter, hollower. Every room carried an echo now, as if the walls themselves were waiting for him to come back. The grandfather clock in the foyer suddenly sounded too loud. The refrigerator hummed through the kitchen like distant machinery. Even the old pipes groaned softly at night in ways I had never noticed before. Or maybe I had noticed. Maybe Richard had simply filled the silence so completely that I never had to hear the loneliness underneath it. I stood alone in the kitchen the morning after the will reading, staring at his coffee mug beside the sink. Dark blue ceramic, tiny chip near the handle. World's most patient husband printed across the front. Michael gave it to him for Father's Day 20 years ago. Richard used that mug every single morning afterward. I reached for it automatically before stopping myself halfway. The mug was still faintly stained from his last cup of coffee. I thought that would be the hardest thing to see that morning. I was wrong. Outside, pale October sunlight stretched across the backyard in thin gray strips. The maple trees behind the fence had begun losing their leaves overnight, scattering orange and yellow across the damp grass. Connecticut always looked beautiful in the fall. That was the cruel thing about grief. The world kept looking beautiful anyway. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and moved slowly through the kitchen. My knees ached from exhaustion more than age. I'd barely slept after returning from Hartford. Not because of the will reading, because of Richard's study. I hadn't gone inside yet. The closed door sat at the end of the hallway upstairs like a held breath. And somehow, I already knew something inside that room mattered. At the time, I didn't realize how important that feeling would become.
The sound of heels clicking against hardwood interrupted my thoughts. Vanessa. Even her footsteps sounded confident. She entered the kitchen already dressed for the day in cream slacks and a fitted black sweater, her blonde hair smooth and perfectly curled despite the early hour. She carried her phone in one hand and a green smoothie in the other. Not once did she ask whether I'd eaten. "Morning," she said casually. I nodded once. "Morning." She opened the refrigerator without hesitation. Our refrigerator. No, not ours anymore, apparently. I watched her move around the kitchen as if she already owned every cabinet and drawer. She hummed softly while checking expiration dates on condiments. Then she tossed half a bottle of Richard's favorite steak sauce into the trash. Something about that tiny action hit me harder than the will reading itself. I stared at the garbage can. 43 years of marriage, reduced to expiration dates. Vanessa noticed me looking. "Oh," she said lightly, "it expired months ago." Months ago. Richard was still alive months ago. I looked away before she could see the expression on my face. The silence between us thickened immediately. Then she smiled. Not warmly, politely, like a realtor speaking to a difficult seller. "Michael and I were thinking we should probably start going through some of the upstairs closets this weekend." My stomach tightened. "This weekend?" "Well," she said carefully, "there's just a lot to organize." Organize. Interesting word. Not mourn. Not preserve. Organize. I walked toward the sink slowly, pretending to rinse Richard's mug, just so I wouldn't have to look directly at her. "I'm not ready for that yet," I said quietly. Vanessa leaned against the counter. "I understand," she replied. But she didn't. People who truly understand grief don't discuss closet space 4 days after a funeral. I thought that was the coldest thing she would say that morning. I was wrong again. Her phone buzzed suddenly. She glanced down and laughed softly. Then she said something that made my entire body go still. "The contractor can probably start before Thanksgiving." Contractor. I turned around slowly. "What contractor?" Vanessa blinked once, clearly not expecting me to ask directly. "For the upstairs remodel," she said. "Michael wants to open the master bedroom wall and expand the bathroom." The master bedroom. Mine and Richard's bedroom. She said it so casually, like discussing paint samples. I stared at her for several seconds before speaking. Richard hasn't even been gone a week. For the first time, irritation flashed across her face. Brief, sharp, gone instantly. "We're trying to move forward, Eleanor." Move forward. Funny how quickly people say that when they're benefiting from someone else's loss.
The back door opened before I could respond. Michael walked in carrying 2 paper coffee cups from town. Not 3, 2. That hurt more than it should have. At 71, you'd think humiliation would stop surprising you. It doesn't. He handed 1 cup to Vanessa automatically before finally noticing me standing there. "Oh," he said awkwardly, "I didn't know you were awake." I almost smiled at that, as if grief allowed sleep. Michael kissed Vanessa's cheek lightly before loosening his coat. Rainwater still clung to his shoulders from outside. For 1 terrible second, he looked exactly like Richard. Same broad frame, same tired eyes, same habit of rubbing his jaw when stressed. Then Vanessa touched his arm, and the resemblance disappeared. "Tell your mother about the upstairs," she said. "Your mother, not Eleanor, not Mom. Your mother." Tiny phrases reveal everything eventually. Michael hesitated. "We were just thinking," he began carefully, "that maybe renovating now makes more financial sense."
There it was again. Financial sense. Every conversation suddenly sounded like a business meeting. I folded my arms tightly across my chest. And where exactly am I supposed to sleep during renovations? Michael avoided eye contact immediately. Vanessa answered instead. "Well, the cabin is always available." The cabin. Again. Always the cabin. A place they'd mocked yesterday was suddenly their preferred solution. Something about that bothered me deeply. Not because of the cabin itself, because they kept pushing me toward it, as if they needed me gone quickly. A quiet suspicion moved through me then, slow, uncomfortable. What exactly were they in such a hurry to do inside this house? I thought back to Richard's study upstairs, the locked desk drawers, the missing paperwork, the nervous look on Mr. Kaplan's face. Something wasn't right. And for the first time since Richard died, I stopped feeling only grief. I started paying attention. Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, nobody's trying to upset you." I almost laughed at that. Nobody had to try anymore. The damage was already done. Vanessa checked her watch suddenly. "We should leave soon," she said. "The flooring guy is meeting us at 11. Flooring guy. The funeral flowers were still in the dining room. I stared at them then. White lilies, drooping roses, sympathy cards still unopened beneath silver candle holders. The house still smelled faintly like funeral arrangements and casseroles from church friends, and they were already shopping for flooring. I suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. Michael stepped closer carefully. "Mom?" His voice softened slightly. For a brief second, I heard the little boy again, the one who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms. But then he said the next sentence, and that little boy disappeared completely. "You know Dad would have wanted us to move on." I looked at him slowly. "No," I said quietly. "Your father would have wanted respect." The kitchen fell silent. Vanessa's expression hardened immediately. Michael looked away first. Good. Let him. Because deep down, he knew I was right. The worst part of betrayal isn't cruelty. It's watching someone betray the person they used to be. They left 30 minutes later. Vanessa kissed the air beside my cheek before walking out the door. Michael barely met my eyes. Then they were gone. And the house became silent again. But not peacefully silent. Waiting silent. I stood motionless in the kitchen for several minutes after hearing the car disappear down the driveway. Then I did something I hadn't done since Richard died. I locked the front door. Not because I was afraid of strangers, because suddenly my own home no longer felt safe. The realization settled over me slowly as I walked through the downstairs rooms. The living room still held funeral guest books. Richard's reading glasses rested beside his recliner. His cardigan hung neatly over the staircase rail, exactly where he left it before the hospital. Every object felt frozen in time. Except Michael and Vanessa. They were moving too fast. Far too fast. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand gripping the banister Richard refinished himself back in 1998.
Halfway up, I stopped. The study door remained closed. Something inside me tightened again. Curiosity, fear, instinct. Maybe all three. The hallway smelled faintly like cedar and old bucks. Sunlight stretched across the carpet through the tall windows near the staircase landing. Dust floated softly through the beams of light. For a moment, I simply stood there listening. Nothing. Then I noticed something strange. The study doorknob looked scratched. Fresh scratches. Tiny. Silver. Recent. My pulse slowed immediately. Richard hated scratches on brass fixtures. He polished those knobs himself every spring. I moved closer. Carefully. And that's when I realized something else. The door wasn't fully shut anymore. Barely open. Just enough to notice. I knew I had closed it completely last night. A cold sensation slid down my spine. Someone had been inside. At the time, I still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. I still wanted to believe Michael wouldn't invade his dead father's office days after the funeral. But then I stepped inside, and immediately knew I was too late. Desk drawers hung partially open. File folders sat crookedly across the desk. Richard's locked cabinet stood slightly ajar. Someone had searched this room. Recently. Carelessly. I walked slowly toward the desk. My heart beat suddenly loud in my ears. Then I noticed the missing space. One entire stack of folders was gone. Not moved. Gone. The realization hit me instantly. Michael and Vanessa weren't just planning renovations. They were looking for something. But what? I opened the top desk drawer carefully. Empty. Second drawer. Empty again. Third drawer. My breath caught sharply. Tucked beneath a stack of yellow legal pads sat a small white envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Eleanor. Nothing else. Just my name. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up. And then I heard something downstairs. The front door opening. Voices. Michael and Vanessa were back. And suddenly, I realized they might not know the envelope existed. Yet. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I stood frozen inside Richard's study, holding it in trembling hands, while voices drifted faintly from downstairs. Vanessa laughed first, then Michael. The sound traveled through the house like something foreign, sharp, out of place. My husband had been dead less than a week, and already laughter sounded wrong here. I slipped the envelope carefully into the pocket of my cardigan, just as footsteps approached the staircase. For one terrifying second, I thought Vanessa was coming upstairs. Instead, I heard Michael's voice from below. "Mom?" I looked around quickly. The office still showed signs of being searched. Drawers left crooked, folders disturbed. Dust smeared across the desk surface where something heavy had clearly been moved. Someone had been desperate in this room. Desperate people make mistakes. At the time, I didn't realize how important that thought would become. I closed the top drawer softly and stepped into the hallway just as Michael reached the staircase landing. "There you are," he said. His tone sounded casual, too casual. I studied his face carefully. Dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes now. His jaw looked tighter than usual. He avoided glancing toward Richard's desk behind me. "Interesting. I thought you and Vanessa left," I said quietly. "We forgot her sunglasses." He pointed vaguely downstairs. Then his eyes shifted toward the study door. A flicker of something crossed his expression. Nervousness, gone almost instantly. But I saw it. Mothers always see it. "What were you doing in Dad's office?" he asked. There it was. Not, "How are you feeling? Do you need anything?" What were you doing in Dad's office? I folded my arms gently across my chest. "Remembering your father." Michael looked away first, again. That had become a pattern. Before Richard died, my son used to hold eye contact naturally, confidently. Now every difficult conversation ended with Michael staring at walls, floors, coffee cups, anywhere except directly at me. People avoid eye contact when carrying guilt or fear, sometimes both. Downstairs, Vanessa called out brightly, "Did you find them?" Michael hesitated before answering. Yeah, but he hadn't moved. Neither had I. The silence between us stretched too long. Then he finally said something that settled coldly into my stomach. "You probably shouldn't stay in here much right now."
I blinked slowly. Why not? He shoved both hands into his coat pockets. It's just, he paused. Painful. Painful. That word almost made me smile. Not because it was cruel, because it was rehearsed. Michael never used vague emotional language before Vanessa entered his life. He used to speak plainly, like Richard. Now every sentence sounded carefully selected, safe, managed. I glanced back toward the office. Your father spent most of his life in this room. Michael's shoulders stiffened. Then he said quietly, and maybe that's the problem. The problem. Not grief, not memories, the room itself. That sentence stayed with me long after he walked downstairs, because suddenly I understood something unsettling. They weren't just uncomfortable with Richard's absence. They were uncomfortable with his presence. And somehow, that office still contained it. The rest of the afternoon unfolded strangely, too normal in all the wrong ways. Vanessa ordered takeout from a trendy Italian restaurant downtown because, as she put it, nobody has the energy to cook. She said it while sitting at my dining room table scrolling through furniture websites. My dining room table, the same oak table Richard spent 6 weekends restoring by hand after we found it at an estate sale in 1989. Vanessa balanced her phone beside Richard's funeral prayer card while comparing marble countertops. I sat across from her silently stirring cold tea. At one point, she glanced up suddenly. "What do you think about lighter floors?" I stared at her. "Excuse me?" "For the house," she clarified. "Dark wood feels dated." The house. Not your father's house. Not your family home. Just the house. I looked toward the hallway where Richard's coat still hung beside the front door, then back at Vanessa. Richard loved those floors. Her smile tightened instantly. Yes, well, tastes change. I thought that was the cruelest moment of the day. I was wrong. Michael came downstairs carrying 3 cardboard boxes from the attic just before dinner. I recognized them immediately. My chest tightened. Old family photographs, Richard's military papers, our wedding albums, Michael's childhood drawings. "What are those doing downstairs?" I asked quietly. Michael avoided my eyes again. Vanessa thought we should start organizing storage. Organizing. Always organizing. Vanessa looked up immediately. There's just so much clutter. Clutter. 43 years of marriage reduced to clutter. I watched Michael set the boxes beside the staircase while Vanessa resumed scrolling through renovation photos. Something inside me began shifting them. Not breaking, hardening, like lake water freezing overnight. At the time, they still believed I was grieving too deeply to notice details. That was their second mistake. Because once pain cools slightly, you begin observing. And I started noticing everything. Vanessa no longer knocked before entering rooms. Michael whispered constantly when phones rang. Cabinet doors upstairs suddenly stayed locked. Even stranger, Richard's study door remained closed almost all day now. Closed. Always closed. Every time I approached it, one of them suddenly appeared nearby. Too quickly. Too conveniently. The pattern became impossible to ignore. After dinner, I went upstairs intending to retrieve one of Richard's sweaters from our bedroom closet. Halfway down the hallway, I noticed something new. A keypad. Small. Silver. Mounted beside the study door. I stopped walking. For several seconds, I genuinely thought grief was confusing my memory. Then I realized the truth. That keypad had not been there yesterday. A cold sensation spread through my chest. Vanessa appeared beside me almost immediately. Too immediately. "Oh," she said lightly. "Michael installed that this afternoon." I stared at the keypad. "You locked Richard's office?" Her smile looked practiced.
We just thought it would be safer while organizing financial documents. Safer. Interesting word again. What financial documents? Vanessa folded her arms. Estate paperwork, mostly. Mostly. Not entirely. I stepped closer to the door slowly. What exactly needs protecting? Vanessa's expression shifted for half a second. Tiny crack. Barely visible. Then gone. You know how sensitive these things can be. No, I didn't know. Because until now, nobody had treated my husband's office like a crime scene.
The hallway suddenly felt colder. Below us, the grandfather clock chimed 7 times through the house. Vanessa glanced downstairs before lowering her voice slightly. Honestly, Eleanor, this whole process would probably be easier if you focused on resting. There it was. Not advice. Containment. I looked at the keypad again. Then at her. You're very eager to control this house. Her eyes narrowed almost invisibly. For the first time since Richard died, silence stopped feeling weak between us. It became a weapon. Vanessa recovered first. We're trying to help. I almost laughed. Instead, I simply nodded once and walked away. But as I reached the bedroom door, I heard something behind me, the soft beep of numbers being entered into the keypad. I didn't turn around. I listened. 4 digits. Pause. Door opening. Door shutting. And suddenly I understood. They weren't protecting paperwork from me. They were protecting something inside that office. Something they hadn't found yet. That night I barely slept. Rain tapped softly against the windows while cold wind rattled branches outside. Richard's side of the bed remained untouched beside me, the mattress still slightly dipped where his weight used to settle every night. I reached across the sheets once out of instinct. Empty. The loneliness nearly swallowed me whole then. Not because Richard was gone, because the house no longer felt like mine either. At around 2 a.m, I heard footsteps downstairs. Very quiet. Very careful. I sat up right immediately. The hallway beyond our bedroom stayed dark, except for faint moonlight spilling through the windows. My pulse quickened as another sound echoed below, a drawer sliding open, then whispering. I slipped from bed slowly and opened the bedroom door just enough to see downstairs. Light glowed faintly beneath the study door. Voices. Michael and Vanessa, inside Richard's office, at 2 a.m. I thought about confronting them. I almost did. Then I heard Vanessa say something that stopped me cold. There has to be another copy somewhere. Another copy? Copy of what? Michael answered too quietly to hear clearly. Then Vanessa spoke again. We can't let her see it first. My entire body went still. Her. Me. I stepped backwards silently before they could notice movement upstairs. The floorboards felt freezing beneath my feet. For the first time since Richard's death, fear entered the grief. Real fear. Not of losing the house, of discovering what my husband had been hiding from all of us before he died, and why Michael and Vanessa were so desperate to find it first. I returned to bed without making a sound, but I didn't sleep again. Instead, I stared into darkness until sunrise, while pieces of the past slowly rearranged themselves inside my mind. Richard suddenly changing passwords 6 months ago. Late-night meetings with Mr. Kaplan. Phone calls ending abruptly when Vanessa entered rooms. That strange tension during family dinners all summer. At the time, I thought illness had exhausted him. Now, I wondered if Richard had been preparing for something much worse. The next morning brought another humiliation. Small, quiet, intentional, which somehow made it hurt more. I walked downstairs around 8, expecting coffee. Instead, I found Vanessa sitting at the kitchen island beside 2 steaming mugs. Only 2. Again. She looked up calmly. Oh, she said. We already ate. Michael sat beside her, checking emails on his laptop. Neither offered me coffee. Neither apologized. Tiny moments reveal the truth faster than dramatic ones. I moved silently toward the cabinet for another mug, then stopped. Half the shelves were empty. I stared at the cabinets. Where are my dishes? Vanessa sipped coffee casually. We packed some things for storage yesterday. While I sat 10 feet away grieving my husband. I opened another cabinet. Empty again. Then another. Gone.
my mother's china, holiday serving trays, Richard's favorite whiskey glasses, packed away without asking me. The humiliation burned slowly through my chest. Michael finally looked up. "We're just trying to simplify things, Mom." Simplify. Such gentle words for violent changes. I closed the cabinet carefully. Then I noticed something else. The back door keypad code panel had changed color. New system. New numbers. I looked at Michael immediately. "You changed the security code." He froze. Only briefly, but long enough. Vanessa answered for him. "We upgraded the system yesterday. Yesterday again. Everything happened yesterday, while I was drowning in grief. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. They weren't waiting for me to leave anymore. They were erasing me while I was still standing inside the house."
I said nothing. That frightened Vanessa more than anger would have, because silence leaves room for uncertainty, and uncertainty scares controlling people. I poured myself coffee slowly, while Michael stared at his screen, pretending not to notice my shaking hands. Then I saw it. One small reflection in the dark laptop screen beside him. A document title. Trust Amendment. My pulse stopped, just for a second. Trust Amendment. Richard changed something before he died, something important enough for Michael and Vanessa to hide. And suddenly, I understood why they were panicking. But I still didn't know what Richard had left behind, or who he truly intended to protect. Until later that afternoon, when someone knocked on the front door, carrying answers neither Michael nor Vanessa expected. The knock came at exactly 3:17 p.m. 3 slow taps against the front door. Not hurried, not uncertain. Deliberate. I stood frozen in the kitchen holding my coffee mug, while Michael looked up sharply from the dining room table. Vanessa stopped typing on her laptop almost instantly. For one strange second, all three of us became perfectly still. Then Vanessa recovered first. "I'll get it," she said quickly. Too quickly. That alone told me something mattered. I watched her smooth her sweater before walking toward the foyer. Michael closed his laptop halfway but didn't stand up. Interesting. My pulse slowed quietly inside my chest, because people only react that way when they're afraid of who might be standing outside. At the time, I still didn't know how much Richard had been hiding from all of us, but deep down, I think I already knew the man at the door would change everything. Vanessa opened it only halfway at first. I couldn't see who stood outside from the kitchen, but I heard a familiar voice almost immediately. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for Eleanor Whitmore." Harold Bennett, Richard's accountant. My stomach tightened softly. Harold had worked with Richard for nearly 30 years, thin, soft-spoken, always carrying the faint scent of old paper and peppermint gum. He'd attended the funeral but left quickly afterwards without speaking much. Now he stood on my front porch holding a leather portfolio against his chest like a shield. Vanessa forced a smile. "Oh, Eleanor's resting right now." I nearly laughed aloud. Resting. That word again. Before I could speak, Harold answered calmly. "I'll wait." Silence. Then I stepped into the foyer. "It's all right," I said quietly. "Please come in, Harold." Vanessa's jaw tightened for half a second before the smile returned.
Tiny cracks. Always tiny cracks. Harold entered carefully, wiping rainwater from his shoes while glancing around the house. And I noticed something immediately. He looked uncomfortable. Not grief-stricken. Nervous. The kind of nervousness people carry when they know more than they want to say. Michael stood as Harold entered the dining room. "Harold," he said carefully. Harold nodded once. "Michael." No warmth, no small talk, just tension. The room felt colder instantly. Outside, rain drifted softly against the windows again, coating the backyard in silver streaks. The house smelled faintly like coffee, furniture polish, and funeral flowers beginning to wilt in the dining room. Death still lingered here, but so did something else now. Suspicion. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. "What brings you by?" Interesting. Not, "Would you like coffee? How are you holding up?" Straight to the point. Harold glanced briefly toward me before answering. "There are some matters regarding Richard's estate Eleanor should probably be aware of." The air shifted immediately. Michael's shoulders stiffened. Vanessa stopped moving entirely. And suddenly, I knew one thing for certain. They were afraid of what Harold might say. At the time, I still wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding somewhere inside all this ugliness. I still wanted to believe my son hadn't become the kind of man who would manipulate his own grieving mother. Then Vanessa spoke, and that hope began dying very quickly. "We already met with Mr. Kaplan," she said smoothly. "Everything's under control." Under control. Funny phrase. People who truly have control rarely need to announce it. Harold remained calm. "I'm sure you believe that." Believe, not know. Michael stepped forward slightly. "What exactly are you here to discuss?" Harold adjusted his glasses slowly. Richard had concerns before his death. The room went silent. My heartbeat became suddenly loud in my ears. Concerns. Past tense. Richard had concerns. About what? About whom?
Vanessa laughed softly then. Too softly. Well, Richard was under a lot of stress near the end. I turned toward her slowly. Something about that sentence bothered me instantly, because Richard had not been confused near the end. Tired, yes. Sick, certainly, but never confused. And suddenly memories began surfacing one after another. Richard locking his study door months ago, phone calls ending when Vanessa entered rooms, that tense silence during Easter dinner when Michael mentioned refinancing the house. At the time, I dismissed those moments. Now they returned differently, sharper. Harold looked directly at me. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "Richard asked me to contact you personally if certain behaviors started happening after his passing." My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Certain behaviors. The phrase settled heavily inside my chest. Vanessa immediately smiled again. I think everyone's grieving emotionally right now. There it was again. Emotional. As if every concern I might have could simply be dismissed as widowhood. But Harold didn't look at her, only me. And suddenly I understood something unsettling. Richard had prepared for this. Not death. Them. I thought that realization would destroy me. Instead, it made me strangely calm. Because if Richard anticipated this behavior, then maybe I wasn't as powerless as Michael and Vanessa believed. Harold sat across from me in the living room 20 minutes later, while Michael and Vanessa remained tense near the fireplace, pretending to check emails and messages. Pretending. Nobody actually worked. Nobody relaxed. The entire room felt staged. Harold placed the leather portfolio carefully onto the coffee table. Richard's coffee table. I remembered the afternoon we bought it together from a furniture maker outside New Haven nearly 25 years earlier. Richard spent 3 hours inspecting wood grain while Michael played Game Boy in the truck because he was bored out of his mind. "You always buy things built to last," I teased Richard afterward. He smiled and squeezed my hand. "That's because temporary things disappear too easily." At the time, I thought he meant furniture. Now, I wondered if he meant people. Harold opened the portfolio slowly. "I'm not here to upset anyone," he began carefully. Vanessa shifted immediately. "But there are some facts Richard specifically instructed me not to ignore." Michael rubbed his jaw. "What facts?" Harold hesitated, then looked directly at me. Richard became concerned that certain financial decisions were being pressured within the family. Pressured. Such a polite word for greed. Michael's expression hardened immediately. "That's ridiculous." But he answered too fast. Much too fast. Vanessa stepped forward smoothly. Richard was sick. Toward the end, he became paranoid about little things. Little things. Interesting choice of words. Not false things. Little things. I watched Harold carefully. He didn't look surprised by her reaction, which meant he expected it. And if he expected it, then this conversation had likely been rehearsed long before today. A cold realization settled quietly over me. Richard must have spoken to Harold about Vanessa specifically. Maybe Michael, too. I thought that was the worst realization of the afternoon. I was wrong. Harold removed a thin folder from the portfolio and placed it gently on the coffee table. "This contains copies of several amended trust documents Richard finalized 6 months ago."
Michael went pale instantly. Vanessa's breathing changed. Just slightly. But enough. I saw it. Fear. Real fear this time. My pulse slowed unexpectedly, because suddenly the power inside the room shifted. Only slightly, but enough to matter. Michael stepped closer immediately. Dad changed the trust? Harold nodded calmly. Yes. Without telling us? Another pause. Then Harold said something that made the entire room feel smaller. He specifically instructed that certain amendments remain confidential until after his death. Confidential. My eyes drifted slowly toward Richard's study upstairs. The late nights. The locked drawers. The whispered phone calls. All of it suddenly meant something else now. Richard had been protecting something. Or someone. Me. The realization hit so hard I almost lost breath for a second.
Because beneath the grief, beneath the betrayal, another truth began emerging quietly. My husband knew exactly what our son and daughter-in-law were becoming. Vanessa recovered first. Of course she did. She sat gracefully in the armchair opposite Harold and crossed her legs carefully. "Well," she said lightly, "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation." Harold looked at her over his glasses. "There is." Silence. Then, Richard no longer trusted certain people with unrestricted access to family assets. No longer trusted. The sentence landed like shattered glass. Michael looked stunned, but Vanessa didn't. That terrified me most, because she looked angry, not surprised, meaning she already suspected this existed. Maybe that's what they'd been searching for inside the study. Not money. Proof. At the time, I didn't yet understand how much Richard had hidden before he died, but I finally understood one thing clearly. My husband had spent his final months preparing for a war inside his own family, and he never told me. That realization hurt more deeply than the will reading itself, because suddenly I began remembering small moments from our marriage differently. Richard checking locks twice before bed, his long silences after Michael and Vanessa visited, the way he stared out kitchen windows late at night without speaking. I thought he was tired. Maybe he was heartbroken instead. Harold continued speaking quietly. There are additional protections attached to specific properties. Properties. Plural. Vanessa leaned forward immediately. What properties? Too eager again. Harold ignored the question completely. Richard instructed me to speak privately with Eleanor before discussing details further. Michael stood abruptly. That's insane. No. What was insane was how quickly he stopped sounding like my son whenever money entered the conversation. I stared at him silently. And suddenly I remembered another version of Michael entirely. Age 9, standing beside Richard in our garage, crying because he accidentally scratched my car with his bicycle. Richard knelt beside him and said softly, "A good man tells the truth, even when he's scared." Back then, Michael cried because he felt guilty over paint scratches. Now he lied to his widowed mother while standing beneath funeral wreaths. Somewhere along the way, I lost my son before I lost my husband. That realization nearly broke me, but I didn't show it, because silence still frightened Vanessa more than emotion did, and I was beginning to understand the value of that. The conversation ended awkwardly 20 minutes later. Too many pauses, too many unfinished sentences. Harold stood near the front door adjusting his coat, while rain hammered harder outside. Then, just before leaving, he turned toward me quietly. "Eleanor," he said, "Richard asked me to remind you of something, if the time ever came." My pulse quickened. "What?" Harold hesitated, then lowered his voice. He said the cabin was never just a cabin. Not if, when. The wording mattered. Richard already knew they would search. That realization settled heavily inside my chest while rain slid quietly down the dark windows behind me. The kitchen smelled faintly like coffee grounds and lemon dish soap, ordinary scents that suddenly felt strange against the weight of what I was holding. For 43 years, Richard protected me from storms I never even saw coming. And somehow, he'd still been protecting me during the final weeks of his life, while I stood beside him completely unaware. I thought that realization would comfort me. Instead, it broke my heart all over again. Because if Richard prepared for this, then he must have died carrying fears he never shared with me. Upstairs, I heard footsteps move faintly across the hallway floor. Vanessa. Even at midnight, I recognized her footsteps instantly now. Sharp, quick, purposeful. I slipped the key quietly into the pocket of my robe, just as movement paused outside the kitchen doorway. Then Vanessa appeared. Her silk robe looked expensive enough to pay someone's rent. Her blonde hair fell neatly over one shoulder, as if even sleep couldn't disturb her appearance. But her eyes moved immediately toward the envelope on the table. Not toward me, the envelope. Interesting. "You're still awake?" she asked softly. I folded the note once before answering. Couldn't sleep. Vanessa leaned casually against the counter. Grief does that. Again, always grief. Every concern I had became grief. Every question became grief. Every instinct became grief. Convenient. She glanced toward the folded paper again. "What's that?" I smiled faintly. An old note from Richard. Not technically a lie, but not the truth either. For one brief second, disappointment crossed her face, before disappearing beneath another polite smile. Tiny cracks, always tiny cracks. "At least you found something comforting," she said quietly. Comforting? No, the note wasn't comforting. It was a warning. At the time, I didn't yet understand how frightened Vanessa truly was. But fear changes people in small ways first. Extra smiles, forced calm, too many questions. And suddenly, I started seeing it clearly. Vanessa pushed herself off the counter. "You should try to rest," she said gently. Then she added something that made my stomach tighten. "Oh," she replied casually. "Michael scheduled movers to start clearing storage spaces." Movers? I stared at her. Without asking me? Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically. "We're only trying to help." Help. There it was again, the language of control disguised as kindness. I watched her leave the kitchen without another word. Then I sat alone in silence for several minutes, listening to the grandfather clock echo through the house. 1, 2, 3 slow chimes. Every sound felt heavier lately, because now I understood something terrifying. Michael and Vanessa weren't waiting for grief to settle before changing the house. They were racing against something, and whatever Richard hid, they still hadn't found it. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. By 7:30, trucks already lined the curb outside the house. Actual moving trucks. I stood upstairs near the bedroom window, watching 2 men unload cardboard boxes and packing blankets, while frost clung to the dead grass outside. The funeral flowers still sat downstairs, and strangers were already preparing to dismantle my life. I thought that would be the cruelest moment of the morning. I was wrong. Michael knocked softly before entering the bedroom. Not our bedroom anymore, just the bedroom, apparently. "You're awake," he said carefully. I nodded once. He avoided eye contact immediately. Again. The distance between us no longer felt emotional. It felt strategic. Michael shoved both hands into his coat pockets before speaking. "We're just organizing things temporarily." Temporary. Another soft word covering something ugly. I looked toward the window. "Your father's been dead 6 days." Michael exhaled sharply. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it already is." That sentence stayed with me, because somehow my grief had become an inconvenience to them. I turned toward him slowly. Hard for who? Silence. Michael looked exhausted suddenly. Older. Lines around his mouth I hadn't noticed before. For one fleeting second, I almost felt sorry for him. Then he said, You know Vanessa's trying her best." There it was. Not, "I'm trying my best. We're trying our best." Vanessa. Always Vanessa first. I realized something painful then. My son no longer spoke like an individual. He spoke like someone repeating a script. At the time, I didn't realize how long that had already been happening. The movers started upstairs shortly after 8. Closets opened, boxes taped shut, furniture measured. Strangers walked through 40 years of marriage discussing square footage and storage costs, while Vanessa supervised from the hallway, holding coffee in both hands, like a project manager. One of the movers accidentally bumped Richard's old military trunk against the staircase wall. The sound echoed sharply through the house. I flinched instinctively. Vanessa didn't. "Just put that one in the garage for now," she called casually. That trunk held Richard's medals, letters from Vietnam, photographs he never showed anyone. Garage storage, like old holiday decorations. I thought my heart had already broken completely after Richard died. Turns out heartbreak has layers. One humiliation at a time. Around 10 o'clock, I quietly slipped downstairs while everyone worked upstairs. The kitchen remained empty, except for cold coffee and scattered renovation brochures Vanessa left across the island. White marble samples, paint palettes, contractor estimates. No mourning, only replacement. I stood silently at the sink staring into the backyard where Richard used to rake leaves every fall with ridiculous precision. He always wore the same faded Yale sweatshirt and complained about his knees halfway through the job. "You know the leaves are just going to fall again tomorrow," I teased him once. Richard smiled without looking up. "Doesn't mean you stop taking care of things." My throat tightened unexpectedly because suddenly I understood something else. Richard never stopped taking care of me either, even at the end, especially at the end. A soft knock startled me from behind. Harold Bennett stood quietly near the back patio entrance, holding a dark wool coat against the cold wind outside. I hadn't even heard him approach, and immediately I knew he hadn't come casually. There was urgency in his face now. Real urgency. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "may I come in?" I nodded quickly. Harold stepped inside and glanced up instinctively when he heard movers walking overhead. Then his expression darkened. They've already started. Not a question, a realization. I folded my arms tightly. Yes. Harold removed his glasses slowly. Richard was afraid this would happen faster than expected. Faster than expected. The sentence chilled me, because suddenly I pictured Richard lying awake at night already predicting how quickly our son would begin dismantling the house after his death. That level of heartbreak must have destroyed him long before illness did. Harold lowered his voice carefully. "Have they found anything in the study?" My pulse quickened instantly. So the study really mattered. "No," I answered quietly. "I don't think so." Harold looked relieved. Very relieved. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded sheet of paper. "Richard told me to give you this only if you found the key first." "The key?" I stared at Harold carefully. "You knew about it?" He nodded once. "But not what it opens." Interesting. Even Harold didn't know everything. Richard compartmentalized information intentionally, which meant he trusted almost no one by the end. Not even his closest advisor completely. I unfolded the paper slowly. Coordinates. Lake Waramack. And beneath them, one handwritten sentence from Richard. "Don't trust conversations inside the house." A cold wave moved through me instantly. Not trust conversations inside the house, meaning Richard believed we were being listened to, or watched, or manipulated. I looked up instinctively. Footsteps moved faintly overhead. "Vanessa." Harold leaned closer. "There's something else you need to understand." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Richard changed more than the will." My heartbeat slowed. "What does that mean?" Harold hesitated. Then, "He transferred certain protected assets months ago." Protected assets. Again that phrase. Always vague, always unfinished. I thought that was finally the answer. I was wrong, because Harold still looked nervous, meaning the real secret remained unsaid. "What kind of assets?" I asked carefully. Before he could answer, Vanessa's voice suddenly echoed from upstairs. "Eleanor?" Harold stepped backward immediately, too quickly. Fear. Real fear, again. Then I understood. Vanessa must not know Harold came today. And suddenly the power inside the room shifted slightly toward me for the first time since Richard died. Small shift, but enough. Harold straightened his coat calmly. "We should talk somewhere else next time," he said quietly. I nodded once. Then Vanessa appeared at the kitchen doorway. Her smile froze instantly when she saw Harold. "Oh," she said lightly. "Back again?" Harold remained polite. "I needed Eleanor's signature on a few estate clarifications." Lie. Smooth. Instant. Practiced. Interesting. Vanessa glanced between us carefully. She knew he was lying. I knew she knew. And somehow that invisible tension felt more revealing than any argument. At the time, I still wasn't fighting back openly. But something inside me had already changed. I stopped feeling like prey. Vanessa walked toward the kitchen island slowly. "You know," she said casually, "Michael and I were discussing the cabin this morning." The cabin again, always circling back to it. Harold became very still beside me. We thought it might help Eleanor emotionally to spend some time there. Emotionally. Again. I almost smiled, because now I finally understood the game. They didn't want me healed. They wanted me removed, quickly, quietly, before I discovered whatever Richard protected. Harold looked toward me carefully. Then he said something that changed the entire atmosphere instantly. Actually, Richard specifically instructed Eleanor not to go to the cabin alone. Vanessa froze. Only for a second, but long enough, because now she understood something too. The cabin mattered far more than she originally believed. And suddenly, for the very first time since the funeral, I saw genuine uncertainty in her eyes. That small moment gave me something I hadn't felt in days. Hope. Tiny. Dangerous. Alive. But hope comes with consequences, because the moment Vanessa realized she might not control the entire situation anymore, she started becoming far more dangerous. And later that night, I discovered just how far she was willing to go to keep Richard's secrets buried. The strange thing about betrayal is how ordinary mornings still look afterward. The sun still rises, coffee still brews, the mail still arrives at noon, and yet somehow nothing inside your life feels recognizable anymore. 3 days after Harold's visit, I stood in my bedroom folding sweaters into cardboard boxes, while Vanessa laughed downstairs with a contractor about backsplash samples. My husband had been dead 9 days. 9. The grief itself no longer felt sharp. It felt cold now, like snow slowly covering everything familiar. I folded one of Richard's flannel shirts carefully before placing it aside instead of into the box. The fabric still carried the faint scent of cedar and aftershave. I pressed it briefly against my chest before forcing myself to continue packing, because now I understood something important. Survival sometimes requires performance, and I had finally started performing. At the time, Vanessa believed she was winning. That was exactly what I wanted. Downstairs, I heard her heels crossing the kitchen tile, sharp, confident, owner-like. Then her voice echoed upward through the staircase. "Michael, I'm thinking lighter paint will make the living room feel bigger." Living room. Not your parents' living room, not the family room, just another property being redesigned. I closed the box quietly and reached for another sweater. Silence became my greatest weapon now. Every time I refused to argue, Vanessa grew bolder, and bold people become careless eventually. That was the first lesson Richard ever taught me about business. Never interrupt someone while they're underestimating you, he used to say. At the time, I thought he was talking about negotiations. Now I realized he'd been preparing me for people. I carried the sealed backs downstairs slowly around noon. My knees ached from climbing stairs repeatedly, but I refused to ask Michael for help. Not anymore. The movers had already cleared half the upstairs guest rooms, plastic covers wrapped around furniture while rolls of carpet padding leaned against walls like construction debris. The house no longer looked mournful. It looked transitional, temporary, like my entire marriage was being erased room by room. Vanessa stood near the kitchen island reviewing paint swatches with a designer young enough to be her daughter. "Oh," she said when she saw me carrying the box. "You packed already?"
Already. Interesting word, as if she expected resistance. I set the box carefully near the foyer. I thought it might make things easier. For one brief second, surprise crossed her face, before disappearing beneath another polite smile. Then satisfaction replaced it, exactly as planned. That's probably healthiest, she said gently. Healthiest. Everything became therapy language around her. Boundaries, healing, closure, healthy transitions. Cold words disguised as kindness. Michael entered from the garage carrying another stack of folders from Richard's office. My pulse tightened instantly. The office again. I watched carefully as he moved toward the dining room table. Folders marked property taxes, estate files, insurance. But one folder remained upside down beneath the others, hidden deliberately. Interesting. Vanessa noticed me watching immediately. She smiled too quickly. Michael's just trying to organize financial paperwork. Organize. Always organize. I nodded softly and looked away as if defeated. Inside, I memorized everything. The hidden folder, Michael's nervous expression, the fact that Richard's office key now hung permanently in Vanessa's purse. At the time, they thought grief had weakened my attention. Instead, it sharpened everything. That afternoon brought another humiliation. Small, quiet, intentional, which somehow made it worse. I came downstairs around 3 and found 2 women standing in my kitchen discussing renovation plans with Vanessa. One pointed toward the breakfast nook beside the windows.
"This would make a beautiful wine corner," she said. Wine corner. I stared silently at the spot where Richard drank coffee every morning for 22 years while reading local newspapers. Vanessa noticed me immediately. "Oh," she laughed lightly, "we're just brainstorming." We. Again, not someday, not maybe, already we. One of the women smiled politely at me. "You must be Eleanor." Must be. As if I were a distant relative visiting temporarily instead of the woman who built the home. "Yes," I answered quietly. Vanessa stepped closer and casually rested a hand on my shoulder. "She'll be moving to the lake cabin soon." Soon. No discussion, no question. Announcement. The woman smiled sympathetically. "Oh, honestly, that sounds peaceful at your stage in life." At your stage in life. I felt the humiliation burn slowly upward through my chest. Not because of the words, because Vanessa said nothing to correct them. Instead, she smiled. I thought that was the moment I hated her most. I was wrong, because Michael walked into the kitchen moments later and sided with her completely. "The cabin's probably better for Mom anyway," he said casually. Mom, not even looking at me while he said it. Less maintenance, less stress, less life. That part remained unspoken. I stood there silently while strangers discussed my future like an assisted living brochure. And suddenly I realized something devastating. Michael genuinely believed he was being reasonable. That hurt more deeply than cruelty ever could. Cruel people know they're cruel, but people convinced they're helping can destroy you without guilt. I smiled faintly. "You're probably right." Every head turned toward me immediately. Vanessa looked stunned. Good, because surrender confuses controlling people. They expect emotion, resistance, negotiation, not calm, especially not from someone they've already dismissed as weak. At the time, I had no actual plan yet, only instincts, but instincts kept me alive long enough to find the truth. That evening, after the contractors finally left, I quietly drove into Hartford alone for the first time since Richard died. I told Michael I needed air. Technically true. What I really needed were answers. The city looked gray beneath low October clouds, while headlights reflected across wet streets. Traffic crawled slowly through downtown as commuters hurried toward restaurants and apartment buildings glowing warm against the cold evening. Meanwhile, my entire life sat suspended between betrayal and mystery. I parked beside Mr. Kaplan's office just before 6. The law office lights still glowed upstairs. Good. I sat in the car for several seconds, gripping the steering wheel before finally stepping out into the cold. At the time, I still believed the cabin might simply contain hidden money or paperwork. I still hadn't understood how much Richard truly changed before his death, and I definitely hadn't understood why Vanessa was terrified of it. Mr. Kaplan looked startled when I entered. "Mrs. Whitmore." His tone lowered immediately. "You came alone?" Interesting question. "Yes." He glanced toward the hallway before quietly closing his office door. That alone told me enough. He was nervous too. Not just Harold. Everyone who knew Richard's final decisions seemed nervous. Why?
I sat slowly across from his desk. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while city lights blurred behind him. The office smelled like old books and burnt coffee. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I finally said, "What did Rechin protect?" Mr. Kaplan removed his glasses carefully. Long pause. Then, "How much has Harold told you?" "Not enough." He nodded slowly. That was intentional. Intentional again. Every answer led to another locked door. I leaned forward slightly. "My son and daughter-in-law are tearing apart my house looking for something." Mr. Kaplan's expression darkened immediately. So Richard was right. My heartbeat slowed. Right about what? The lawyer hesitated too long. Then he opened a file drawer and removed a thick folder marked Warramog Holdings. Holdings, not cabin paperwork. Holdings. The word alone changed something inside me instantly. Mr. Kaplan placed the folder carefully onto his desk. The lake property is not simply a vacation cabin. I stared at him silently. He continued.
Richard's father purchased surrounding land parcels quietly during the 1970s. Land parcels, plural. The property was eventually transferred into a protected family trust structure years ago. Trust, again that word. Every conversation now circled back to hidden protections and secret transfers. I felt suddenly aware of my own breathing. How much land? Mr. Kaplan paused. Just under 200 acres. I genuinely thought I misheard him. The cabin I remembered from family summers was tiny, rustic, weathered. One old dock and a fishing boat Richard barely maintained. 200 acres made no sense. Unless the cabin itself was never the important part. At the time, I didn't yet know the true value of that land, but I finally understood why Vanessa kept pushing me toward it while simultaneously fearing it. Because she didn't know what Richard transferred there, and uncertainty was driving her insane. Mr. Kaplan opened the folder carefully. Maps, property surveys, investment records. Then he revealed the part that changed everything. Richard moved several protected investment accounts into the trust 6 months ago. My stomach tightened. How much? Another pause. Then the number came. Enough to explain everything. Enough to explain the searching, the manipulation, the panic. Enough to explain why Michael suddenly stopped feeling like my son whenever Vanessa entered the room. I sat motionless for several seconds staring at the paperwork. Rain hammered harder outside now. The office suddenly felt smaller. Not because of the money, because Richard knew. He knew exactly what would happen after his death. And instead of confronting Michael directly, he quietly built a fortress around me. My throat tightened painfully. Why didn't he tell me? Mr. Kaplan looked genuinely sad then. Because he was afraid you'd try to protect Michael. The truth of that hit immediately. Because he was right. Even now, part of me still wanted to save my son from himself. That's the terrible thing about motherhood. Love doesn't disappear just because betrayal arrives. Sometimes it survives long enough to hurt you twice.
Mr. Kaplan slid one final document toward me, a trust amendment signed 3 months before Richard died. At the bottom sat one handwritten sentence for my husband. If Eleanor chooses to leave the main residence willingly, all protected assets transfer solely under her authority. Willingly. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Vanessa pushing the cabin, the humiliation, the renovations, the emotional pressure. They needed me to leave voluntarily because Richard anticipated legal challenges otherwise. And for the first time since the funeral, I smiled genuinely, not from happiness, from understanding, because suddenly I realized something extraordinary. Richard's final gift wasn't money, it was leverage. And neither Michael nor Vanessa had any idea I finally understood the game they were playing. But when I returned home later that night, I discovered Vanessa had already made her next move. And this time, she stopped pretending to be kind. I left for the cabin before sunrise. Not dramatically, not angrily, quietly. That mattered, because people like Vanessa expect emotional exits. Tears, accusations, one final scene they can later describe as unfortunate but necessary. I gave her none of that. At 5:40 in the morning, I carried 2 suitcases through the silent foyer while cold October rain drifted across the front windows in soft gray streaks. The house smelled faintly like fresh paint samples and sawdust now. Not home anymore. A project. I paused briefly beside Richard's coat still hanging near the staircase. For several seconds, I simply stood there, touching the sleeve with my fingertips. 43 years together, reduced to fabric and silence. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. Vanessa. Even half asleep, I recognized the rhythm instantly. Quick, sharp, controlled. I stepped away from the coat just before she appeared at the top of the staircase, wrapped in a pale cashmere robe. For one strange second, neither of us spoke. The foyer glowed softly beneath the chandelier, while rain whispered against the windows behind me. My suitcases rested beside the front door like evidence of surrender. And Vanessa looked almost disappointed, because I was leaving too easily. At the time, she still believed she had won. That illusion would not survive much longer. "You're leaving already?" she asked softly. I nodded once. "You said the cabin would be peaceful." Vanessa folded her arms loosely. "I just thought some space might help." Help. Always help. I smiled faintly. "I'm sure it will." For the first time since Richard died, uncertainty crossed her face again. Small, brief, gone instantly. Because deep down, controlling people become nervous the moment resistance disappears. They start wondering what they missed. Behind her, I heard another floorboard creak. Michael. He stood halfway down the staircase wearing sweatpants and an old Yale hoodie Richard bought him years ago. His hair looked messy from sleep. For one heartbreaking second, he resembled the young man who used to carry my groceries inside without being asked. Then he spoke. "You're really going?" Really going? As if he hadn't spent 2 weeks pushing me toward the door. I adjusted my gloves slowly. "You said the cabin was better for me." Michael looked away immediately. That hurt more than words ever could.
Vanessa descended the remaining stairs gracefully. "We'll make sure the rest of your things are sent up later." Sent up, like seasonal decorations. I thought that would be the cruelest thing she said that morning. I was wrong, because Michael added quietly, "It's probably for the best right now." For the best. The same phrase hospitals use before delivering terrible news. I studied my son silently, and suddenly I realized something devastating. Michael no longer sounded like someone making choices. He sounded like someone asking permission to survive his own marriage. That realization softened my anger for one dangerous moment. Then Vanessa slipped her arm through his casually, and the softness disappeared. I picked up my suitcase. "Well," I said quietly, "I hope the renovations make you happy." Vanessa smiled. "Oh, they will. Not maybe. Not hopefully. Will. Interesting. Because people only sound that confident when they believe the future belongs entirely to them." I opened the front door before either of them could say anything else. Cold air rushed inside immediately, carrying the scent of wet leaves and pine trees from the hills beyond West Hartford. Dawn hadn't fully broken yet. The world outside looked silver and blue beneath the rain. For one brief second, I almost turned around, almost asked Michael one last time why he was doing this. But then I remembered the hidden folders, the midnight searches, the manipulation, and most importantly, Richard's warning. If they start searching, go to the cabin first. So I left, without tears, without pleading. That frightened Vanessa far more than grief ever could. The drive north took nearly 2 hours. Rain faded gradually as Hartford disappeared behind me mile by mile. Connecticut unfolded in long stretches of stone walls, orange maples, gas stations, and quiet country roads lined with skeletal trees already losing their leaves. The farther I drove, the lighter my chest became. Not happier, safer. At the time, I still didn't know exactly what waited for me at the cabin, only that Richard trusted it more than our own home, and somehow that meant I trusted it too. Lake Warramog appeared just after 8 o'clock, beneath pale morning fog. Still, silent, beautiful. The water stretched across the valley like polished gray glass, while rolling hills surrounded the shoreline in deep autumn colors. Tiny docks disappeared into the mist. Smoke rose lazily from distant chimneys. Richard always loved mornings here. feels untouched, he used to say. Now I understood why that mattered to him. The cabin itself sat hidden near the northern side of the lake, behind a long gravel road bordered by pine trees and old stone fencing. I hadn't visited in nearly 3 years. The moment it came into view, my throat tightened unexpectedly. Still small, still weathered, still wrapped in cedar siding Richard stained himself every spring. Nothing about it suggested wealth. That was the brilliance of it. I parked slowly beside the porch while gravel crunched beneath the tires. Silence surrounded everything. No contractors, no voices, no manipulation. Just wind moving through trees. For the first time since Richard died, I could finally hear my own thoughts again. I stepped out slowly, breathing in cold lake air sharp enough to sting my lungs. The cabin smelled exactly as I remembered once I unlocked a door. Cedar, dust, old books, firewood. Home. Real home. Not the house Vanessa redesigned in her mind before Richard's funeral flowers even died. This place still belonged to him, and somehow still belonged to us. I carried my suitcase inside and froze immediately. The fireplace mantel looked untouched, except for one new object resting at the center. A sealed envelope. My name written across the front again in Richard's handwriting. Eleanor. At the time, I still thought I was uncovering the end of Richard's plans. I had no idea I was only entering the beginning. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope beside the fireplace. Inside rested another note, and a second key, larger this time. Brass. Beneath it, Richard wrote only one sentence. Everything important is below. Below. I stared at the words for several seconds before slowly looking around the cabin. Then I remembered. The basement. Or rather, what Richard always called the lower storage room. Interesting detail, because Richard rarely used careless language. My pulse quickened quietly. Outside, wind moved softly across the lake while branches scratched faintly against the cabin roof. Something waited beneath this place. Something important enough for Richard to hide from everyone, even Michael.
I found the basement door behind the kitchen pantry exactly where it had always been. Narrow wooden stairs descended into darkness beneath the cabin. I reached for the light switch instinctively. Nothing. Power disconnected downstairs. Interesting. I stood at the top step listening. Silence. Then I noticed something else. A newer lock attached near the basement door handle. Not old, not rusted. Recently installed. Richard added this shortly before he died, which meant whatever waited below had been hidden recently too. I inserted the brass key slowly. Click. The lock opened immediately. A cold sensation moved through my stomach, because suddenly this no longer felt like inheritance. It felt like discovery. The basement smelled faintly like cedar and concrete once I descended with a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Dust floated through the beam while old shelves lined the walls, stacked with fishing equipment, canned goods, and toolboxes Richard hadn't touched in years. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Then I saw the steel cabinet, brand new, bolted into the far wall. My heartbeat slowed instantly. This was it. I moved closer carefully. Another lock, smaller, silver, and suddenly I remembered the first key, hidden inside Richard's envelope. My fingers trembled slightly as I removed it from my coat pocket. The cabinet opened with a soft metallic click. Inside sat documents, folders, property maps, bank statements, investment records, and beneath all of them, photographs. I picked one up first. Aerial land surveys, dozens of acres surrounding the lake. Then another, mineral rights agreements. Then another, investment accounts connected to protected trusts worth amounts so large I genuinely had to reread the numbers twice. My knees weakened slightly. The cabin was never the asset. The land was. Richard had spent years quietly expanding ownership through hidden trust structures connected to the lake property. And somehow, nobody knew, except him. Not Michael, not Vanessa, maybe not even Harold completely. I thought the money would be the biggest shock. I was wrong, because underneath the financial records sat something infinitely more painful. A leather journal. Richard's handwriting filled every page. Dates, observations, private notes. About Vanessa, about Michael, about me. My chest tightened painfully as I opened to the first marked page. She's isolating him slowly. Another page. Michael avoids eye contact whenever finances come up now. Another. I don't think Eleanor sees what's happening yet. Tears blurred my vision for the first time in days. Not because of the money. Because my husband spent his final months documenting the slow destruction of our family while trying to protect me from seeing it. And somehow, he carried that burden alone. I sat there on the cold basement floor for what felt like hours, reading page after page while wind rattled softly outside above the lake. Richard knew. He knew everything. The manipulation, the pressure, the greed. And instead of confronting them directly, he built an escape route for me. Quietly, carefully, lovingly. The realization shattered something inside me, but it also rebuilt something else. Strength. Real strength. Because suddenly I understood. I was never abandoned here. I was protected here. Then I reached the final page of the journal and discovered one last sentence Richard wrote 3 weeks before he died. A sentence that changed everything again. If Vanessa discovers the Wyoming file before Eleanor does, nothing will stop her. Wyoming file. I froze completely, because I had no idea what that meant. And worse, I couldn't find any file labeled Wyoming anywhere inside the cabinet, which meant one horrifying possibility remained. Someone else already had it. The invitation arrived 2 days later. Cream-colored cardstock, gold lettering, Vanessa's taste a cackly. Family dinner, Sunday evening. Not welcome back, not reconciliation, an event. I sat alone at the cabin kitchen table reading the card while wind moved softly across Lake Warramog outside the windows. Late afternoon sunlight reflected against the water in silver ripples, while pine trees swayed gently along the shoreline. Peaceful, almost painfully peaceful. And yet somehow, the invitation felt dangerous the moment I touched it. At the time, I still didn't know whether Vanessa suspected I had discovered the truth about the trust, but I knew one thing immediately. She would not invite me back unless she believed she still controlled the board. I folded the invitation carefully beside Richard's journal. Then I looked toward the basement door. The missing Wyoming file still haunted me. Every night since arriving at the cabin, I searched the steel cabinet again, hoping I'd overlooked something. Nothing. No file. No mention beyond Richard's final warning. If Vanessa discovers the Wyoming file before Eleanor does, nothing will stop her. That sentence repeated constantly in my mind now. What was in Wyoming? Land? Accounts? Evidence? Or something worse? I thought the missing file was the biggest threat. I was wrong. Because by Sunday evening, I realized the real danger wasn't hidden paperwork. It was how desperate Vanessa had become. The drive back to West Hartford felt strangely familiar, not comforting, haunting. The closer I came to the house, the heavier the silence inside the car became. Bare November branches stretched over the roads, while twilight settled softly across Connecticut neighborhoods, glowing with porch lights and early Christmas decorations. Normal life. That was the strange thing about family betrayal. The world keeps decorating itself while your life quietly collapses. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed 3 unfamiliar vehicles parked outside. Guests. Interesting. The dining room windows glowed warm against the darkening evening sky, while shadows moved inside the house I once called home. My stomach tightened softly. This wasn't dinner. This was theater, and Vanessa intended to perform. At the time, she still believed humiliation would push me fully into surrender. She didn't realize Richard had already armed me with the truth. I stepped inside at exactly 6 o'clock. The smell hit first. Rosemary chicken, candles, expensive wine, then voices. Laughter drifted from the dining room immediately before stopping the moment I entered. Of course, Vanessa stood near the fireplace wearing dark green silk, diamonds glittering softly beneath the chandelier. Beside her stood 2 couples from their country club and Michael near the dining room bar pouring wine. No one looked uncomfortable except Michael. Interesting. Vanessa smiled brightly the second she saw me. There she is. Not Eleanor, not Mom, There she is, like I was late entertainment arriving. I removed my coat slowly. The foyer looked different already. New artwork, different flowers, furniture moved slightly. Tiny changes, deliberate changes. Vanessa stepped closer and kissed the air beside my cheek. "You look rested," she said sweetly. Translation: "You look removed." I smiled faintly. "The lake air helps." For one brief second, something flickered behind her eyes. Concern. Tiny, fast, gone. Good. Because deep down, she still feared the cabin. That fear mattered more than she realized. Michael approached awkwardly, holding a wine glass. "Mom?" I nodded once. My son looked exhausted again. His tie hung loose. Dark circles deepened beneath his eyes now. He seemed thinner somehow. Stress. Interesting. At the time, I still believed Michael was weak. I hadn't yet realized he was trapped too.
Dinner began 15 minutes later beneath low candlelight and forced conversation. Vanessa seated me at the far end of the dining table beside a woman named Cheryl, who spent most of the evening discussing spa memberships and Naples vacation homes. I barely listened. Instead, I observed. Vanessa controlled every conversation tonight, every refill, every laugh. Too polished, too intentional. And Michael barely spoke unless directly addressed. Something inside this marriage had shifted recently. Pressure, maybe panic. The dining room itself looked almost unrecognizable now. New fabric samples covered the sideboard. Paint swatches rested beside crystal serving dishes. One entire wall already held blue tape markings from future renovations. They weren't planning changes anymore. They were erasing us in real time. Halfway through dinner, one of the country club guests smiled politely toward me. "So, Eleanor," she asked, "how are you enjoying retirement at the cabin?" Retirement? Interesting word. Vanessa answered before I could. "She's adjusting. Adjusting. Like relocation after surgery." I took a slow sip of water. "The cabin's beautiful this time of year." Vanessa laughed softly. "I'm sure it's cozy." Cozy. There it was. The insult hidden beneath elegance. Small cabin, simple widow, quiet exile. The table smiled politely. I thought that was the humiliation Vanessa planned for the evening. I was wrong. Because then she leaned back casually and delivered the line she'd clearly rehearsed. "Honestly," she said lightly, "Richard always worried Eleanor was too sentimental to handle financial realities." Silence. Small, sharp, intentional silence. Every person at the table looked toward me immediately. There it was. Public humiliation disguised as concern. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap. Across the table, Michael stared at his wine glass instead of me. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. Because silence from strangers is awkward. Silence from your own son is betrayal. Vanessa smiled sympathetically toward the guests. She gets emotionally attached to things. The cabin's probably healthier for her long term. Healthier again. Always healthier. As if removing me from my own home had been an act of compassion. One of the guests nodded awkwardly. "Well, transitions are difficult at any age." At any age. Translation. Especially your age. I let the silence breathe for several seconds before answering calmly. Richard actually trusted me with more than most people realized. The table grew still immediately. Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Interesting." She heard the warning inside the sentence. Good. At the time, nobody else at that table understood the power shift beginning beneath the conversation, but Vanessa did. That's why she suddenly changed the subject, too quickly. "So, Cheryl," she laughed lightly, "tell them about the Palm Beach property." Palm Beach property. Money talk. Distraction. Classic Vanessa. But the mood had already shifted slightly, because now she wasn't certain what I knew, and uncertainty frightened her. Dinner continued awkwardly after that. Michael drank too much wine. Vanessa laughed too loudly. The guests kept exchanging confused little glances whenever tension surfaced beneath the conversation. Then came dessert, and with it, the beginning of the end. The doorbell rang at exactly 8:14 p.m. One chime. Everyone paused. Vanessa frowned immediately. "We're not expecting anyone." No, she wasn't. That mattered. Michael stood first. "I'll get it." But before he reached the foyer, the front door opened. Mr. Kaplan stepped inside, holding a leather briefcase beneath one arm. The entire room froze. Even from the dining room, I saw the color drain slowly from Vanessa's face, because she recognized two things instantly. He wasn't invited, and he looked very serious. At the time, I still didn't know Harold had arranged this meeting behind the scenes, but the moment I saw Mr. Kaplan, I understood tonight had never truly belonged to Vanessa. It belonged to Richard.
The lawyer removed his coat calmly. "Apologies for interrupting dinner," he said evenly, "but there are estate matters requiring immediate clarification." Vanessa stood too quickly. "Now?" Her voice cracked slightly. Tiny crack, huge meaning. Mr. Kaplan nodded once. "Yes, now." Silence swallowed the dining room. The guests looked deeply uncomfortable now. Good, because public humiliation feels very different once direction changes. Michael stepped forward. "What kind of clarification?" Mr. Kaplan opened his briefcase carefully and removed several folders. Then he said the sentence that shattered the room completely. "The West Hartford property is under severe leveraged debt obligations tied to recent refinancing agreements." Michael froze. Vanessa went pale instantly. One of the guests blinked slowly. "I'm sorry, what?" Mr. Kaplan continued calmly. "The property carries significant financial exposure due to loans approved 18 months ago." Loans. Refinancing. My pulse slowed quietly, because suddenly I understood why Michael looked exhausted lately, why Vanessa seemed increasingly frantic. The house wasn't wealth anymore. It was pressure. Massive pressure. Michael stared at the lawyer. "That's temporary." But his voice lacked conviction. "Interesting. Very interesting." Mr. Kaplan remained posed. "Unfortunately, several balloon payment structures mature within 14 months. Balloon payments." The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, and suddenly the mansion Vanessa fought to control no longer sounded glamorous. It sounded dangerous. Vanessa recovered first. There must be some mistake. No, there wasn't. And deep down, she knew it. Because then Mr. Kaplan revealed the real blow. The protected Lake Trust assets are entirely separate from these liabilities.
Silence. Complete silence. I watched Vanessa carefully. Her breathing changed immediately. Panic. Finally. Mr. Kaplan turned toward me. Under Richard Whitmore's amended trust structure, all protected holdings connected to the Warmog Trust transferred solely under Eleanor Whitmore's authority upon her voluntary relocation to the cabin property. Voluntary relocation. Richard planned every detail, every humiliation, every push, every manipulation. He knew they would pressure me to leave willingly, and by doing so, they activated the very protection they were trying to avoid. The brilliance of it almost made me smile. Michael looked physically ill. "What holdings?" he whispered. Mr. Kaplan opened the folder slowly. Then came the numbers. Land values, protected investment accounts, trust reserves, long-term mineral and development rights. Millions. Far beyond what Vanessa ever imagined. The room went dead silent. One of the guests quietly set down her fork. Vanessa stared at me across the table, like she no longer recognized the woman sitting there. Good, because she never bothered learning who I truly was in the first place. Michael finally looked directly at me for the first time in weeks. "Mom." His voice sounded small suddenly, almost childlike. Too late. Far too late. Vanessa stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous." But anger had replaced confidence now. Huge difference. Mr. Kaplan calmly slid one final document across the table. Richard's signed trust amendment. At the bottom sat his handwritten note. "If Eleanor is no longer welcome in the family home, she is to control everything connected to the Warmog holdings without interference." Without interference. Richard knew. Every single thing. The humiliation Vanessa planned for me tonight slowly turned inward instead. And for the first time since Richard died, I watched her lose control. Completely. But then, Mr. Kaplan said one final sentence. A sentence that changed the room all over again. "There is, however, one remaining unresolved matter concerning a missing Wyoming file." The moment those words left his mouth, Vanessa stopped breathing, and suddenly, I knew she'd seen that file before. Vanessa's face lost all color the moment Mr. Kaplan mentioned the Wyoming file. Not surprise, recognition. That distinction mattered. The dining room went completely silent around her, while candlelight flickered softly against crystal glasses and untouched dessert plates.
Outside, cold November rain slid down the windows in silver streaks, turning the world beyond the glass blurry and distant. But inside that room, everything had suddenly become painfully clear. Michael looked between Vanessa and Mr. Kaplan in confusion. What Wyoming file? His voice sounded smaller now, fragile. Vanessa recovered quickly, too quickly. I have no idea what he's talking about. Lie. Instant. Smooth. Automatic. I watched her carefully across the table while Richard's final warning echoed quietly through my mind. If Vanessa discovers the Wyoming file before Eleanor does, nothing will stop her. At the time, I thought the file contained hidden money. I was wrong. It was something far more dangerous. Mr. Kaplan closed the folder slowly. That discussion can wait for another time. Vanessa stood abruptly. No, she snapped. If you're making accusations, say it clearly. There it was, the mask slipping. For weeks, she had hidden cruelty beneath polished smiles and therapy language, healing, boundaries, healthy transitions. Now panic cracked through the performance. Michael stared at her. Vanessa. That she ignored him completely. Mr. Kaplan remained calm. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. Then why bring it up? Silence. Heavy silence. Then the lawyer said quietly, because Richard believed the file might disappear after his death. Disappear. Not be lost. Disappear. Very different word. I saw Vanessa's hand tighten around her wine glass. Tiny movement. Huge meaning. And suddenly, I knew. She'd already searched for it. Maybe desperately. Maybe unsuccessfully. The power inside the room shifted again. Not loudly, quietly, like ice cracking beneath water. One of the country club guests cleared his throat awkwardly. We should probably— Yes, Vanessa interrupted sharply. I think dinner's over. No argument there. The guests left quickly after that, coats pulled tight against the rain while tension followed them through the foyer like smoke. Nobody looked directly at me on their way out. Interesting, because people avoid eye contact when they witness humiliation turning backward. And tonight, Vanessa finally understood what that felt like. I remained seated quietly at the table long after the front door closed. Michael stood near the fireplace, rubbing his jaw repeatedly, while Vanessa paced beside the kitchen island. Panic changes pacing first. Richard used to say that too. The body reveals fear before the mouth does. God, I missed him. Not the money, not the trust. Him. The only person who ever made rooms feel safe. Vanessa finally stopped pacing and turned toward me. What exactly did Richard tell you? Straight to it. No pretending anymore. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. Enough. That answer frightened her more than details would have, because uncertainty leaves room for imagination, and imagination destroys controlling people. Michael stepped closer slowly. Mom, he said quietly, please just tell us what's happening. Mom. Interesting. He only remembered that word when afraid. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. Your father knew he couldn't trust this house anymore. The sentence hit like shattered glass. Michael flinched visibly. Vanessa froze again. Good, because some truths deserve silence after they land. At the time, part of me still wanted Michael to deny everything, to finally stand up to her, to say he'd been manipulated too. Instead, he looked away. Again. And somehow that hurt worse than all the insults combined. Mr. Kaplan gathered his papers quietly. Then he turned toward me. I think Eleanor should return to the cabin tonight. Vanessa reacted instantly. That's unnecessary. Too fast. Too emotional. Fear again. Mr. Kaplan remained composed. Actually, I believe it's very necessary. Silence. Then Michael finally spoke. What's in Wyoming? Nobody answered immediately. Rain hammered harder outside while the grandfather clock echoed through the foyer. Tick, tick, tick. Every second suddenly felt loaded. Mr. Kaplan adjusted his glasses slowly. Richard discovered unauthorized financial activity connected to several offshore holding structures 18 months ago. My pulse slowed instantly. Unauthorized activity. Michael frowned. What does that mean? The lawyer hesitated. Then, it means someone attempted to leverage protected trust assets without legal authorization. Leverage, loans, refinancing. Suddenly, pieces started connecting in terrifying ways. I looked toward Vanessa slowly, and for the first time since Richard died, she looked genuinely cornered. At the time, I still thought Creed was the center of this story.
I was wrong. Desperation was.
Vanessa spoke carefully now. You're making this sound criminal. Interesting word choice. Nobody had said criminal. Mr. Kaplan closed his briefcase softly. I'm saying Richard became concerned enough to move all protected holdings beyond direct access. Michael stared at his wife. Vanessa. His voice cracked slightly. And suddenly I saw something heartbreaking. He truly didn't know everything. Not all of it. Vanessa had been leading this long before Michael understood the depth of it. That realization changed something inside me. Not forgiveness, but clarity. Michael wasn't innocent, but he also wasn't the architect. He was weak. There's a difference. The confrontation ended without shouting. Somehow that made it sadder. Vanessa retreated upstairs without another word while Michael remained standing alone in the dining room, staring at Richard's empty chair at the head of the table. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, "Did Dad really think I'd hurt you?" The question nearly destroyed me, because the answer was yes, and Richard documented exactly why. I looked down at my folded hands. Your father thought fear changes people. Michael sat slowly across from me. Rain softened outside now, leaving only faint tapping against the windows. The house suddenly felt exhausted, like all the lies inside it had finally become too heavy. I didn't mean for things to go this far, he said quietly. There it was. Not apology. Explanation. People always explain themselves before they apologize. I studied my son carefully. The little boy still existed somewhere inside him, buried beneath weakness, buried beneath Vanessa, buried beneath greed and avoidance and fear. But buried things still damage what grows above them. I know, I said softly. And somehow, that was worse for him than anger. I left the house 30 minutes later. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, quietly. Again, because dignity doesn't need an audience. The drive back to Lake Warramog felt different this time. The road stretched dark and wet beneath the headlights, while Connecticut forests blurred past in deep shadows and silver fog. But my chest felt lighter now. Not healed, just clear. For weeks, I thought I was fighting to keep my family together. The truth was, my family had already ended long before Richard died. I simply hadn't accepted it yet. The cabin welcomed me with silence. Real silence. No manipulation, no whispered meetings, no renovations disguised as compassion. Just wind moving gently across the lake. I stood on the porch for several minutes after arriving, staring across the dark water beneath moonlight. Tiny ripples reflected silver beneath the trees, while cold air pressed stealthily against my skin. Peace feels strange after chaos, almost suspicious. At the time, I thought the worst was finally over. I was wrong, because the next morning, Michael arrived alone. I saw his truck near the gravel road around 8:30 while making coffee. No Vanessa. Interesting. Very interesting. He stepped onto the porch looking exhausted, unshaven, older somehow. The pressure was finally showing. I opened the door before he knocked. Neither of us spoke immediately. Cold lake air drifted between us, while distant geese moved across the water beyond the trees. Finally, Michael said quietly, "She left." I blinked once. "Vanessa?" He nodded slowly. "She moved into a hotel last night. No drama, no tears, just collapse. Interesting how quickly power disappears once money becomes uncertain." Michael stepped inside carefully. The cabin smelled like cedar smoke and fresh coffee now. Warm, calm, real. He looked around slowly. This place feels different. Because nobody here is pretending anymore, I thought. Instead, I asked, "What do you want, Michael?" That question nearly broke him. Not because of the words, because of the distance inside them. He sat heavily at the kitchen table and stared at his hands for several seconds. Then came the sentence I'd waited weeks to hear. "I'm sorry." Simple, late, real. My throat tightened painfully. Because mothers spend their whole lives wanting to believe apologies can restore broken things. Sometimes they can't. Sometimes the damage becomes part of the structure.
I sat across from him quietly. "I loved your father very much," I said softly. Michael nodded immediately. "I know." "No," I whispered. "I don't think you do." Silence. Heavy silence. Then tears filled his eyes for the first time since the funeral. I messed everything up. Yes, he had. But grief teaches strange lessons eventually. One of them is this: understanding someone's pain does not erase your own. I reached across the table slowly and rested my hand over his. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just humanity. Michael cried quietly beside the lake while morning fog drifted across the water outside. And for the first time in weeks, he looked like my son again. That hurt almost as much as losing him. Winter arrived slowly after that. The cabin changed with the seasons. I repaired the porch, repainted the kitchen, restored Richard's old workshop downstairs. Not because I needed the money, because building things heals something grief cannot reach. Snow eventually covered the shoreline in soft white scammons, while smoke curled gently from the cabin chimney each morning. I learned how peaceful loneliness could feel once manipulation disappeared from it. People assume healing looks dramatic. It doesn't. Usually it looks like making coffee in silence without fear. Michael visited occasionally. Never too long. Never unexpectedly. Careful now. Respectful. That mattered. Vanessa never returned. Last I heard, the refinancing collapsed after several investigations into unauthorized financial transfers connected to outside investment accounts. The Wyoming file explained everything eventually. Harold found it hidden inside a secondary storage locker Richard rented under another trust name. Not money. Evidence. Emails. Transfer requests. Unauthorized signatures Vanessa attempted before Richard locked down the assets. Richard kept proof of everything. Not to destroy Michael. To protect me if things became irreversible. And somehow, that final realization hurt most of all. Because it meant my husband spent his last months preparing for the possibility that love alone would not save this family. He was right. Some nights I still sit beside the lake, wrapped in Richard's old flannel, watching moonlight move across the water. I think about betrayal, about grief, about silence. But mostly, I think about survival. Because in the end, Richard didn't save me with money. He saved me with truth. And after everything that happened, truth became the only home nobody could take away from me.